Well, thank you so much, Quinn, for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you, Courtney, for the invitation to be here this evening, and thank you to the Dearborn REALTIST Board members, to Bank of America and the other sponsors, as well as this evening's honorees for making this incredibly important convening happen. And also, thank you to Bobby Simmons and Society for hosting tonight's event. That's right, give it up for our sponsors. I am so proud to be in this room full of powerful leaders and advocates, and I'm even more proud to know that we are here to think intentionally and strategically about the different ways in which we address the disparities in the Black community around home and land ownership. Here are some facts. First of all, for many Black households, the housing crisis never ended. While 73.1% of white Americans own homes as of the second quarter of 2019, a record low 40.6% of Black Americans achieved home ownership. Secondly, the resulting 32.5 percentage point gap in home ownership between Black and white Americans is 3.6 points wider than it was at the beginning of 2010. So in other words, the hard-won gains that Black homeowners made when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 has virtually been erased. This means that Black families rent for more years before becoming homeowners than we did just a few years ago. Now, this trend will shrink the landscape of housing choices available to Black families, increase our exposure for displacement, and delay or close off a key wealth-building mechanism. And these outcomes will only widen inequities, health disparities, and life outcomes that are at the core of many of the struggles that our communities face today. Now, Governor Pritzker and I are hard at work to address the challenges in our state that also impact home ownership. For example, while education is vital to ensuring economic success, student debt can contribute to the home ownership gap. A recent report states that for Black borrowers who entered institutions of higher education in 2003 to 2004 as undergraduates, almost 49% defaulted by 2016. Up to 70% of this cohort is projected to default by 2024. And that's why, as part of our fiscal year 20 bipartisan balanced budget, we increased funding for public universities by over $50 million and increased funding for community colleges by $14 million. And we also made college more affordable by expanding merit-based scholarships and MAP grants for students from low-income families to 7,000 more students, while also increasing the size of these grants. Thank you. We added an additional $50 million for MAP grants this year, and we have made a commitment to make sure that we keep making increases. Now, we also understand that the lack of access to quality jobs and a living wage can also serve as a barrier to home ownership. And we not only secured a $15 an hour minimum wage, but we created a plan, our Rebuild Illinois Capital Plan, that will invest billions of dollars into our state's infrastructure and create over 500,000 jobs. As part of this plan, labor unions will expand apprenticeship programs so that people from our community not only have immediate access to available jobs, but can also begin a lifelong career. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that the governor and I made sure that financial counseling services were funded as part of our budget, and we dedicated millions of dollars to the small business development centers so that small business owners and entrepreneurs across our state can be supported and receive help. We are focused on addressing disparities in Black home ownership and tackling other challenges so that we can promote equity and create opportunity for people all across our state. Here's the bottom line. We simply cannot have justice without equity and opportunity. And the fight for justice can never be limited to just talking about policing, jails, and prison. We must also have included in this conversation economic prosperity, health care, education, and of course, housing. Now, we will now have a panel discussion where we will elevate solutions from stakeholders on how we can address the disparities in Black home and land ownership, including something that's really important to me and to all of our communities: how do we address the issue of successful reintegration of formerly incarcerated men and women? So I'm going to begin our panel by giving each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask you, please, in the interest of time, to be very brief, keep it under 2 minutes, your name, your title, and just 1 or 2 sentences about your background, and then we'll get started with this important conversation. Thank you. Yep. Oh, yes, we need the mic.
Okay, I'll kick it off. My name is Rob Rose. I am the Executive Director of the Cook County Land Bank Authority. And I'm here really tonight to talk about not only what the land bank does, but really to talk about what we can do to use the tools available to us to start investing into the communities that we care about.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Wendell Harris. I am the Vice President of Lending Operations at the Chicago Community Loan Fund, also known as CCLF. We are a 28-year-old community development financial institution that's focused on ultimately solving problems in communities of color, primarily in Cook and the 5 Collier counties, but we have a heavy interest in serving our people on the south and west sides of Chicago. So what that looks like is we look at all asset classes for investors and developers and try to find solutions for them to help strengthen the fabric in those communities. In addition to that, we help nonprofits and social enterprises help support the people in those communities.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony Simpkins. I am the Managing Deputy Commissioner for the City of Chicago's Department of Housing. Proud to be with a progressive administration now that's focused on investments in Black and brown communities. I have worked for a long time with these gentlemen right here to promote exactly that, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about both the need and the strategies to do just that tonight.
Great. Can we give our panelists another round of applause? Thank you all for being here tonight. So let's get started with our conversation. So as I stated earlier, Black home ownership, the rate of Black home ownership right now in 2019 is really just below what we saw in the rates in 1968. So I'm going to start with Rob and Wendell. Is it Wendell or Wendell? Wendell. I'm going to get that right. So I'm going to start with Rob and Wendell. Why has Black home ownership remained stagnant? And we're going to take each question about 2 minutes for each question.
Okay. So a lot of this was covered by Mark in his opening remarks in terms of what was happening or what has happened. It's still, in my view, still intentional nowadays in terms of why the home ownership rates, the denial rates, the acceptance rates are trending the way they are. So if you think about what we can do or what needs to happen to reverse that, a couple of things. The advocacy work that the Dearborn REALTIST and NAREB is doing nationally has to be supported at the state and local level. And so if they're the only voice talking about Black home ownership, then that's one thing. But if we got this conversation, so I'm talking about also other real estate association groups, financial institutions, CDFIs, coming together to build a coalition to talk about this as a crisis, we can start to have some more conversations to move us toward what we need to have in terms of smart regulation and in terms of action steps that we can take both in our underwriting and our process to be able to reverse some of these trends. Mark said it beautifully. We have to affirmatively take actions to move us in another direction. It's not going to happen by happenstance. And anytime there's change in this country, that means that there is a coalition of people that come together to demand that change. And until we're willing to do that, we're going to stay just as stagnant as we've ever been in terms of where we are right now. The status quo has us at 40%. If we're happy to be status quo, let's go. But if you want to move it in a different direction, if black realtors, you want to make some money and be able to get a customer base that's underserved right now, let's get together and make some noise so we can move these policies in the way that we need to move them.
Great comments. In addition to that, as the conversation trickles down from the leadership level to the advocacy level to the policy level down to the people on the ground floor at the communities, I think we have to collectively work together, right? So what does that mean? Sometimes it's actually, you know, having some difficult conversations that force us to kind of look in the mirror, right? And understand where we are currently in order to prepare ourselves for where we're trying to go, right? So for example, right, we have the Dearborn group. Very actively, this thing just doesn't like me at all. Very actively trying to work with the community, right, to be able to find ways to help folks into. Yeah, I think it's cutting me out. Testing, okay. We're going to try to get folks in the homes, right, and organizations collectively working together, right, trying to help individuals build capacity to help stabilize these vacant and abandoned properties, one, right, finding the right local folks, investors to be able to give them capital, right, also connecting with local organizations that are working together to help find folks in those communities to be able to put them in place and stabilize those assets.
Thank you. So I know everybody here knows how important wealth building is as we have this conversation about home ownership. But we also know that there have been a number of policies and laws that have caused harm to our communities. We can all think about them. We can think of redlining. We can think of restrictive covenants. We can think of subprime lending or predatory lending. All of these kinds of things that have happened that have really caused harm and have really prevented the levels of home ownership we want to see. I'm going to direct this question to Anthony. What should policy and or lawmakers consider when we think about and address equitable housing policy, specifically as it relates to black people and home and or land ownership? What do we need to be thinking about from a policy-making standpoint or lawmaking standpoint to help repair some of the harm that's been done by these policies?
Thank you. Sure. So something I found that was very interesting was that between 2010 and 2017, the rate of increase in the value of homes in predominantly low mod, African American, black and brown neighborhoods was about 8% between 2010 and 2017. In majority white neighborhoods and neighborhoods of wealth, high cost neighborhoods, the property value increase, excuse me, was 63%. So what does this mean? The American dream is about home ownership, and that home ownership then creates wealth through the appreciation of property values. What we're seeing is that that's not happening for African Americans, right? In our neighborhoods, even when we do own a home, that home is not representing the kind of wealth appreciation that it represents for other communities. The key to this, I think, when it comes to policy and reversing the legacy of segregation and redlining, is access to capital. It's both access to retail mortgage lending so that African Americans can get mortgages and buy homes, but it's also access to the kind of development capital that developers need to buy and rehab homes and to buy land and build homes in our communities. Because our communities are largely not owned by people that look like us, which means that the wealth that's generated in the communities that we live in is not wealth that's being generated that directly benefits black and brown people. And the real key to that is access to capital.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to then now move down to Rob. So when Anthony talks about some of these policies and what we need to be thinking about and the long-term consequences of them, what do we need to do to educate Illinoisans? Because I think there's a lot of people who don't even realize the history of what, I know some of you saw the reports that came out, some articles that came out over the recent weeks and months that sort of lay out what happened. But what do we do to make sure Illinoisans understand the history? It does not repeat itself.
So I think we're off to a good start. When you think about the Dearborn programs in which they have a faith-based initiative and they're using the black churches as a vehicle for education, I think that's a good start. And there are a number of programs around town in different communities to talk about home ownership, but these workshops are pretty limited and there's only so much that can come from it. I honestly think that we need to start considering putting this into the education of our high school students so they can understand how to balance a checkbook, what a mortgage means, what a checking account is, how wealth works, compounding interest, and make this a part of high schools. I mean, maybe this is going full circle, but I took home economics when I was growing up, which doesn't exist anymore, at least not now that I've seen. And that's where I learned all those things. I think it's time to go back to that, to institutionalize that so that it's something that everybody is getting a chance to see, learn, and understand, and know that it's attainable, as opposed to the patches that we have right now. So if you're talking about what we can do to reverse this trend, I'm saying embed it in the education so that everybody can get a chance to see this and hear it, and we can take the time that it takes for this to become institutionalized into the thinking of our youth.
Thank you. I love that, and I love you kind of posing it as beyond just financial literacy. Financial literacy is important, but you talked about it from a wealth building and how do you understand how wealth is built? Not just that you can balance the checkbook, what kinds of investments and other things you need to be making. Wendell, let's now talk a little bit about the regulatory perspective. So what can we do to hold lenders more accountable? Again, also wanting to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself.
Sure. So I think it is a collection of things, right? So at the institutional level, we have to work to help build capacity to be able to get individuals of color in prominent positions to help effectively support the push for change in leadership, right? in regulation, right? In addition to that, I think we all have to truly take time and understand kind of what the lay of the land is, right? We know what the condition is at the federal level, right? We know what we're dealing with, and I think with that, we have to just have some real conversations with ourselves, right? Take time and look at, where our communities are, where our people are, right? And for example, right now we're working on a host of different initiatives with the city of Chicago, right? One in particular is the Chicago Neighborhood Rebuild, right? Which is effectively trying to look into communities where people of color are and help them build capacity, right? Open up the floodgates for capital and allow those that have various levels of capacity, give them opportunities to build capacity, stabilize these assets that are in these communities, and ultimately that can in turn allow individuals to be able to build wealth.
Thank you. So one of the aspects of my portfolio as Lieutenant Governor is helping to build out and work with Main Street and urban Maine, and really thinking about how can we build strong and thriving commercial business districts and corridors, and really revitalize those corridors, which is really important to thriving communities as a whole. And so I've been traveling, talking with a number of different business owners, talking with urban planners and developers, and I've really had a chance to sit down and talk with people who own small businesses around the state. Heard, sorry, this is going in and out. One of the things that I've sort of consistently heard is an issue about vacant lots. Vacant lots, businesses that have been shut down, they're boarded up. No one is able to come into those businesses because somebody is holding on to those places, and they just, for whatever reason, there's a benefit to them. It's not a benefit to the community, and oftentimes it's not people from our community, but they're holding on to these businesses. They're not revitalizing these businesses or rehabbing them, and they're just sitting there. Or we have vacant lots. So my question to Anthony and Wendell is, what advice would you give to both entrepreneurs and real estate investors regarding the best practices to sort of navigate the complexities of the vacant property and land issues?
Sure. So from the standpoint of both investing wisely and creating wealth for oneself, and also helping to improve and revitalize our communities, one of the things that we found that's very important on both a programmatic level and on the level as an individual investor is to aggregate investments. So areas that have a proliferation of vacant properties or lots, if you're going to invest in those areas, it's best to pick up as many properties as you can that are geographically close proximity. What does this do? This increases the value of one of your assets as you invest. It creates an increase in the local property values, creates efficiencies for your own management. From a programmatic standpoint, what we've also found is that when we aggregate public investments geographically, and we take a comprehensive approach to invest in neighborhoods, what we find, we're much more when we aggregate our investments. So that's one strategy. I think that's important.
I can't get anything. I get no respect with this microphone. It might work. Okay, great. And I'm sure you all probably see all three of us tapping each other on the leg back and forth, and it's because we work so closely together. So Rob leaned over in my ear and said, "You know, it's my turn, right? This is not your role, Wendell. You are a lender." But I'll say a couple words. So in conjunction with Anthony Simpkins' comment around aggregation, right? I think ultimately having all investors at all tiers, right, connecting with the city, connecting with the land bank to effectively understand what the strategy is, right, globally, right? Because again, the power is in numbers, right? If you have investors at every level, right, at the small level, you got, local folks, mom and pop investors that are working on 1 to 4 unit asset classes, right? You got more seasoned investors that are looking at multifamilies, right, 5 units or more. You got some commercial investors that are looking at the commercial spaces, allowing the housing, the folks that move into the housing to have resources, right? In that framework, right, capital has to step in, and we talked about opening up the floodgates to capital, right, and being able to have a formulated front to be able to solve the problems.
Well, this is an unabashed commercial for the land bank, because this is what the land bank does, is we aggregate vacant and abandoned properties around the county. And one of the things that we're looking at as we move forward the next 5 years is to get state legislation so we can create land banks across the state. Right now, we were able to do it in Cook County through local ordinance, but this is a strategy that we have given proof of concept of how you're able to do this. And this is something in terms of a solution that can help with the state. The county land bank works very closely with the city and the other 134 municipalities within the county to identify those properties, aggregate them, and then be able to make them available. And we're limited by the laws and how we are able to do that, the tax sale and the circuit courts and things of that nature. But a structure exists for us to be able to get to those properties. Specifically for the problem you're talking about here in Chicago, World Business Chicago has convened a group of neighborhood groups that have come together, and I'm a part of that group where we're talking about that and actually have been able to engage with the assessor. He's well aware of that practice of people having the properties and is taking steps to change their operating procedure so the tax break that they had enjoyed goes away. So it removes that financial incentive, along with the neighborhood groups being able to put pressure on them in terms of being able to occupy it or sell it. And of course, the land bank being there to give them a graceful exit if they need to get out from under that property. So we have the beginnings of something that can help to address that systemically, which is, I think, what we want to be able to do is address this in a systemic way so we don't do one-offs, as Wendell was saying, but we have a collective that we can bring people to the collective to make it happen.
You know, let me just quickly add one thing, if I could. She's looking at me. She's like, I didn't tell you to do that. Right? One of the things that's important to remember is that investing in real estate, whether we're building new homes or whether we're rehabbing, it's also creating employment for our people. It's creating wealth for the people in our neighborhoods. It's increasing business capacity in our neighborhoods. Wendell mentioned the Chicago Neighborhood Rebuild Program, which is a program that actually all three of us are involved in. And what it does is it's access to capital and some capacity building for small rehabbers, black, and providing them capital. So it's a small program, but it's hitting all of these. You know, they talk about black and brown neighborhoods and neighborhoods of disinvestment. They're not neighborhoods of disinvestment. There's plenty of investment that's going on in our neighborhoods, but it's by people that don't look like us, and it's by people that don't have the best interests of our neighborhoods at heart.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to combine my last question because I think it's sort of related, and I know it was important to get your perspective. It's okay. It was important to get your perspective on the land bank. So I want to ask about the concept of justice. I talked about justice, equity, and opportunity in my remarks earlier. And so I want to ask about people who are returning from being incarcerated, people returning from our Department of Corrections, because when we talk about our communities, it's never enough to just say, we just want certain people to kind of move ahead. We have to think about our entire community. And we know that black and brown people, and black people in particular, are disproportionately incarcerated and touch the criminal justice system. So when it comes to people coming out of that system, how can men and women, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of affordable housing? And I think that that specific question is to Rob and Anthony, but I'm going to ask you all, as I'm going to pass the mic, give each of you an opportunity to say one thing that, as you think about our Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, what's something that I can work with you all on to make sure when you talk about we need people in certain positions of leadership, well, there might be a few right now, and so this is a good time to talk concretely. So can you give me one thing that we could perhaps work on as we leave this event?
So one thing we can work on. So when people come out of prison, there are two things that become barriers to them, which are housing and access to employment. The Cook County just passed a just housing ordinance, which provides more access to people with criminal records when they want to buy a home or rent an apartment. The city is working on a similar initiative to remove barriers from people with criminal records to housing. That's something I think we could work on a statewide level.
Okay, I'll be quick because it might stop on me again. So I'll give an example. So we recently closed on a transaction for an organization called Road to Righteousness on the west side of Chicago, actually in the Austin community. They recently closed on or opened a facility called Emma's House, and it's a transitional living facility. If the local legislation could find ways to find subsidy for nonprofits that are ultimately trying to help stabilize the 1 to 4 unit asset class and create spaces for individuals that are transitioning, I think that would be very helpful.
I will say, we can go one step further. We have houses in our inventory that we have set aside. We're working now at Cook County. We have a joint housing steering committee that we put together. And it's the Land Bank, it's the Housing Authority of Cook County, it's JAC, along with the Bureau of Economic Development, Department of Highways and Transportation, and Public Health. Because we know it crosses all of those different lines in terms of what we need to be able to do. So the inventory can be available, and that's the easiest part of the transaction. What's needed, as Wendell said, is there needs to be funding. There needs to be intentional funding for a program like this, and it needs to be sustained, right? It can't just be we do it this year or next year, but it has to be something that can be sustained so we can create a system. Right now we're fighting systems that have been taking us one way. We've got to create a system to take us back the other way. So we can find a constant funding stream to be able to board folks and provide transitional housing and ease that transition back. From the housing standpoint, that's something that the Land Bank and other land banks and organizations could easily support with our inventory.
Can we give it up for our panelists tonight? Thank you all. This was so informative, and I'm really grateful for you sharing your expertise and knowledge and your passion for this issue. And thank you all for being here tonight. This is a really important discussion that I know will continue. And I know that Governor Pritzker and I certainly look forward to working with all of you and all of you here tonight on some of the solutions. And we look forward to that partnership. Thank you so much. And I will now turn it over for the next panel.